A generic drug is a copy of a drug that is now off patent. It works just as well as the original and is normally cheaper. A generic drug is supposed to be more affordable because there is nothing proprietary about it. The secret recipe of the original version becomes public once the patent expires, and generics come along to provide a more affordable option. That secret recipe becomes public because part of us as a society believes that everyone should have access to the medications they need. However, this doesn't always happen. Let's take insulin glargine as an example. Insulin glargine is a long-acting insulin used by close to 3 million Americans today. The patent for insulin glargine expired in 2015, and at the time the price was about $200 per vial. Despite the patent expiring 10 years ago, the price of insulin has only continued to rise, and today it costs about $300 per vial. What's weird about this is normally when a patent expires and generics come to market, it dramatically decreases the price of a drug. On average, it's between 50 and 80%. The generic version of insulin glargine is only 15% cheaper than the brand name version. So while generics are supposed to make drugs more affordable, sometimes there's a disconnect. So I wonder, can generic drugs be a public good, something that everyone can access affordably? Congress has recognized the importance of generic drugs and has enacted laws to help generic drug manufacturers gain market share and introduce cheaper alternatives for patients. In 1984, Congress took bipartisan action to expedite the FDA approval process for generic drugs. And 30 years later, they increased access to biosimilar drugs, which are the generic version of drugs made from living organisms like insulin. Thanks to Congress's efforts, 90% of the medications used today are generics. This is compared to just 15% back in 1984. Through legislation, we acknowledge a shared value that drugs can only be cash cows for so long, and at some point, these drugs are something everyone should have access to. We have the legislative infrastructure in place to de-risk the process of bringing generic drugs to market. This should allow competitors to enter the market and reduce the price of our drugs. So the question is, does this happen in practice, and are generic drugs actually a public good? Despite efforts to protect patients from the high price of drugs, 30% of Americans don't take their medications as prescribed because of cost. 3 in 10 Americans are suffering from pain or risking long-term complications of chronic illness because of prohibitive drug prices. More Americans can't afford their prescription medication than the population of California. And I've seen the personal impact of this statistic in my personal life. A close friend of mine with Crohn's shared that his medication is so expensive, without insurance, he'd be spending $8,000 a month on a generic drug that he cannot function properly without. Another friend with diabetes shared that she had to ration her insulin in her 20s, which means she took less than she was supposed to. Rationing takes a toll on the body, and unfortunately her eyesight deteriorated. Now in her 30s, she can afford her insulin, but the damage to her eyesight is irreversible. I've heard dozens of others share stories of how they struggled to afford their medications and the sacrifices they've had to make just to keep moving forward. So if the high price of generic drugs affects so many people, why aren't they more affordable? Traditionally, generic drugs are made by for-profit companies. These companies are beholden to their investors and are pressured to make these investors as much money as possible. This, I believe, is why some generic drugs are so expensive. I'm not the first person to argue that for-profit companies focus on quarterly revenue goals and yearly profit margins comes at the expense of patients. Advocacy groups fight for patient rights and demand that companies include patient health outcomes in their goals instead of only focusing on their bottom line. One way to do this is to make sure the people who invest in generic drug companies are investing in patient health outcomes first. If generic drugs were made by nonprofits and government entities, they would not be pressured by investors when setting the price of their medication. They would be focused on long-term sustainability, positively impacting patients, and reducing negative health outcomes, because their stakeholders expect patient health outcomes to come above all else. Do we want to live in a world where investors are setting the price of our medications? Or do we want to live in a world where nonprofits and government entities, overseen by patients, advocates, and community members, focused specifically on maximizing patient health outcomes, are setting the price of our medications? So then the next question is this happening today? There are several organizations working on shifting generic drugs towards public good status. For example, Civica RX is a nonprofit making 80 generic drugs and selling them at affordable prices. The state of California is investing in manufacturing and distributing their own insulin to protect the people of California from exorbitant drug prices. And I'm the founder of Project Insulin, a nonprofit organization making its own biosimilar insulin glargine that will sell directly to patients at cost, regardless of insurance status. We're doing our part to make generic drugs the public good through our mission of ensuring everyone who depends on insulin has access to it. Once our insulin is on the market, we're hoping to sell it for $25 a vial. That's compared to $300 a vial today. This will save millions of patients up to $10,000 a year, on top of savings in the form of reduced complications with diabetes and emergency room visits. It will allow millions of Americans to stop having to choose between their life-sustaining medications or important quality of life improvements. We want to build towards a world where no one has to choose between their medications and healthy food, furthering their education, or being stuck in a bad job just for the insurance benefit. We want to live in a world where generic drug companies are focused on patient health outcomes. So let's build drug companies whose financial and legal obligations are to patients. And one day soon, we'll be able to say that we live in a world where generic drugs are a public good.